When we seek to understand, we open ourselves up to learning more. Through our work, sometimes relationships are strained, and part of that is the emotion piece. We can better influence others when we better know and understand ourselves.
Welcome to Unplugged, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This is the podcast that strips away the fluff and gets real about poultry science from bench to barn. I'm your host, Andy Vance, Executive Director of the Poultry Science Association. In this week's episode, we sit down with Dr. Jeff King, Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Ohio State University Leadership Center. The idea this week is to explore the powerful role emotional intelligence plays in leadership, collaboration, and personal and professional fulfillment. You know, there are a lot of things that we need as scientists, as researchers, as technical experts in poultry science to be successful beyond our mere scientific technical expertise. Dr. King is going to share some insights from his research on how emotional intelligence can help you become a better leader, a better scientist, a stronger team member, and a happier person, both in and outside the lab. Dr. King did his studies at The Ohio State University, a fellow Buckeye like me. His undergraduate and graduate studies are in agriculture education, human community resource development, and extension education. His research program at Ohio State's focused on these ideas of leadership development and emotional intelligence and leadership, both in the context of organizational development and extension education. Dr. King, you've been a friend for a long, long time, somebody I've looked up to as a leader and one who's inspired me to get involved in my own graduate studies in leadership. So I appreciate you coming on the podcast to share some of your deep knowledge in this space. I want to step back a little bit before we get too into the weeds on applications to the scientific arena. What initially drew you to focus so much of your career efforts, your research, your professional outreach on this idea of emotional intelligence as part of leadership development?
It's almost by accident. When I became director of the OSU Leadership Center, actually the person before me, Gary Ernest, was certified in emotional intelligence to be able to do assessments and do training around it. And I was coming in behind him and they just said, Gary had this, so you need this. And that is actually how I got started. And it's something that just clicked. I could even see myself having those strengths and weaknesses related to that. So I had to grow in that area, but it was strictly really, Andy, by accident.
And I'm guessing, based on your experience in extension, and it worked in extension from county level on through to state level administration throughout your tenure at Ohio State, I'm guessing when you started digging into the literature and the training on emotional intelligence that you were kind of taken back to all those different stops along the way and how emotional intelligence plays out and all the various aspects of our work and daily life. Is that a fair guess?
Oh, that's definitely fair. I mean, I spent over 20 years in the area of 4-H youth development at the county level, the state level, and emotions can run high sometimes in the 4-H world, both on the part of professionals, on parents, advisors. And if I only knew then what I know now, I would have been much more effective and been able to help more people. Yeah, you definitely see how emotions play out at work and at home.
Me as a wannabe social scientist, I often, will refer to our friends in the hard sciences, the real sciences, so to speak, which I know you'll elbow me on making that in good jest. But I want to maybe frame this for folks who haven't been as steeped in the social science literature as you are and as I'm learning to be. Let's define this concept of emotional intelligence for a minute. What are we talking about? And maybe also make the case of why, if I'm listening to this podcast, I should care.
First of all, it's that reminder that we all have emotions. We're going to show them differently. And the idea of emotional intelligence is really our ability to identify what we're feeling and why. That's self-awareness. How are we able to manage it? How do we react to things? And then how do we also then better understand the emotions of others? And then how do we make linkages through conversations, through discussions, and really build relationships? So it's that element of self-awareness. How do I manage myself? And then how do I better understand others' emotions and what do I do?
You started that with, hey, it's a reminder that we have emotions. I think some of us, especially maybe some of us of a certain age, or maybe I'm speaking to guys who look like me, they're strong, manly men, like we were raised, that maybe young men don't have emotions or we need to suppress those or whatnot. But I sense that as a society, we've maybe had a greater awareness in my adult life that you do have these crazy, warm and fuzzy or less warm and fuzzy things called emotions, and that's okay. And you should learn how to deal with them. How has our understanding of emotional intelligence evolved in the time that you've been studying it and helping people understand how to master this concept of emotional intelligence?
Well, I think you begin to allude to that in your comments, and that idea in the past, emotions have been something that overall from society, something more personal, more private. I grew up on a farm, milked cows with family raised horses at the same time. And, from emotion perspective, you didn't talk about your emotions. You didn't share those elements of emotions. And if something wasn't going right, you sucked it up and you went out and did what had to be done.
Right.
So I've had to learn over time because I mean that impacted me. That whole concept, the role of emotions, that I keep it to myself. I don't share those types of things. But you think about that influence over others, that's a part of who we are. And how much do we interpret from other people? So as time has gone on, I think it's become more acceptable for us to share emotions, to share kind of what we're feeling about something and how that is influencing us. And I think part of what we have to get over is sharing your emotions is not equivalent to being emotional.
Mm.
Being emotional is the emotions are just driving everything. Emotional intelligence is understanding that why am I feeling this way? And what's that telling me? So it's that misunderstanding, I think, too, when it comes to emotions. But what I've seen over time is it's becoming more comfortable, but we're not there yet. And many times it's a concept. I'm an expert in a field. How do I help others to understand that?
Yeah, I like how you frame that. And I think you make a great point that, that's that culturally ingrained in us. Hard to change overnight, right? And I should also acknowledge, because we're, an international association, you and I are talking about this from a very, US or Western focus. Certainly, if we were in different parts of the world, your mileage may vary with regard to what your cultural norms and mores are, which maybe, as I'm thinking about this in the context of collaboration, research teams, lab settings, that emotional intelligence may be even more important because we may be operating from a different cultural playbook and different norms based on where we were raised and did our undergraduate studies and so on. Is that something you see play out in the workplace?
Yeah, I see that playing out even at a university setting. You have individuals from across the world coming together, different cultures, and it is our awareness of that. And it kind of creeps over into the other concept of cultural intelligence also, understanding the needs of other cultures and how you might read and understand why somebody may be reacting a certain way, why they may prefer a certain piece there. But it really still links and comes out of that idea of emotional intelligence, but it's that expanded view of it.
You said something earlier, I think bears repeating, because one of the things that I could imagine as a roadblock to, leaders, teams, companies, departments at universities, and so on, is this idea that, oh gosh, if we're talking about emotional intelligence all the time, we're going to be sitting around singing kumbaya and crying each other's cornflakes, and you're never going to get anything done because we're all yada, yada, yada. But you made that point earlier. Understanding or acknowledging emotional intelligence doesn't give you free reign to be emotional. These two things are not synonymous.
Right. And that's probably as a barrier to some is if I'm sharing my emotions or if I share something like that, I'm being emotional. Or when we're listening to somebody,
Mm.
it's also, how we interpret others. So if others are sharing something emotional, something that's really bothering them, sometimes some people can think, gosh, keep your emotions to yourself. Don't share that.
Mm.
But see, that's a part of relationships. A key link here is this concept of empathy.
Yeah.
I mean, empathy, even with outside of the world of emotional and social intelligence, empathy is a foundational leadership skills. How can we put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and better understand why they're feeling the way they are? You don't have to agree with it. And that's another piece. You don't have to agree with how they're feeling. But if we're going to connect with other people, if we want to better understand where they're coming from, we have to also interpret and try to better understand that emotion. And it comes down to just somebody shares an idea in a lab, somebody shares an idea in a class. It's that idea, okay, how do I listen to that? How do I try to understand their perspective? I don't have to agree with it, but how do I seek to understand? And when we seek to understand, we open ourselves up to learning more, to maybe fine tuning some concept we thought, gosh, we're experts here. But that just adds a little bit more to it. That gives me a little bit more of an edge. That's important to realize that empathy isn't just listening to somebody. To me, it's also about the opportunity to learn. And gosh, what can I do with that?
That idea of empathy, I mean, it's so powerful, and I think it's easier for people to understand if they think about themselves. People want to be heard. When your kids are screaming at you about something, really, they just want to know that you hear them, right? Or your coworkers, your team, they want to feel seen is maybe the phrase that gets used more today. And so if you turn that around then and think, okay, am I doing a good job of listening or making sure the people on my team or the people around me feel seen and heard? So I want to start thinking about this in the context of some of the teams that our listeners might be working on. So,
Mhm.
in your experience, as you're working with university colleagues or industry participants, because you work both in the academic and industry context with clients at the Leadership Center, how does emotional intelligence directly affect the success or struggles? Gonna make that direct connection to success and struggles that you've seen out in the field.
Yeah, I think one, if you think about teams making decisions, teams prioritizing, you bring a group of, 10, 12, even, 10, 12 people together, so, half a dozen individuals, people come with their own thoughts and ideas. And I think when it comes to that emotional intelligence and that empathy, how do we listen to a collective group, share our perspectives, but also listen to others to determine what's going to be the best route to move forward? What's the best use of the information that we have here at the table? And what can happen sometimes is it becomes a competition. I want to share my idea, somebody else shares their ideas. How can we garner support? Who wins? If we take a step back and we think about how does the team win when we're able to share more openly those ideas? And I think empathy is a part of that. So I think that's one aspect. Another aspect when it comes to teams is decision making. And I often ask the question, in decision making, should teams use more from an emotion side or more from a cognitive thinking side?
Yeah.
Which one's better? And what do 90% of the time, which one do you think they say is better?
Show me the data.
Yeah, show me the data. What's the cognitive? And I'm not trying to cut that down, but it's the idea the emotion side is better understanding what's the impact
Hmm.
of that information on people, on the system. How do I fine tune it? How do I use that emotion information in my decision making process?
Well, you're talking to a bunch of scientists, so they're probably all nodding and saying, "Yes, show me the data, show me the data, show me the
Yeah.
data." And yet the marketers who are listening to us are probably saying, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, that's great, but I can tell you that people make decisions with their heart first and then justify it. They find the data to justify the decision." That's a little bit what we're talking about here, right?
That's a little bit what we're talking about. And it's us being more open to learning about each other's perspectives and considering the emotion side of that piece. Because information we learn through research often has to have an impact on people. How do we relate those things to individuals? And I think if we included those things earlier on, we all could be more effective in our communication, in our understanding of what's the best way to deliver this information.
Yeah.
How do I put it in the context that touches somebody's heart as well as their head? And I think that begins in a laboratory, begins with scientists coming together with research assistants. How do we work through this? It's not one or the other. It's the combination of both that I think is so critical to lead to success.
We've talked about empathy here a fair bit. Stephen Covey is one of my heroes. You alluded to it earlier when you say the whole idea of seek first to understand and then to be understood. Most of us do it the other way around, of course. In addition to empathy, what are some of the most common gaps in emotional intelligence that you see that tend to hold teams or, organizations back? Are there common areas where you say, oh yeah, every time I go in to consult with an organization, these are the two or three biggest areas where people need to work on improving or developing emotional intelligence?
There would be the empathy one. And to some, it's also goes back to what we talked about earlier, our own emotional self awareness. Am I aware of what I'm feeling and why? We're making decisions, but yet our emotions are influencing that. Sometimes our pride or ego begins to influence that, and we don't realize it. So, that whole emotional self awareness to me is key because that's a part of, if I'm really going to understand somebody else, I need to acknowledge it first in myself.
Yeah.
So, I think that emotional self awareness is often a key piece of emotional and social intelligence. Then you have the empathy. And then the other one is the decision making. How do we best make decisions? And there's that element of balance between cognitive as well as emotion. But again, it's not one or the other, it's how they work together.
What are the traits that you think stand out most clearly in highly effective or high performance organizations? Is it those same ones we were just talking about, or are there two or three things where you say, man, if you would really focus on these one or two things, it's going to move the ball down the field so far?
I think from high performing teams, one of the driving forces of that needs to be clear goals, clear direction. Here's what we're trying to achieve. That there's buy-in to that overall goal. Because fundamentally, why do we want to be more effective with emotional and social intelligence? Why do we want to be more effective in our leadership? We have to have it in the context of a bigger picture. What are we trying to grow and develop? So in itself, successful teams is being clear on that direction. Being clear doesn't mean just the leader telling everybody else. It is being clear and gaining individuals buy-in and support to it. And then that gives that sense of purpose of why do I want to be more effective? Why do I want to hear somebody else's perspective? Why do I want somebody to evaluate my own ideas to see what works and what doesn't?
Yeah.
It's that driving goal. So I think that's where it starts. And then it's each individual coming together. How am I listening to others? It's not a competition of ideas. It's about what can I learn from that and being willing to learn to achieve the greater good. You see, the focus isn't on my individual desire. My focus is on the team goal, the research goal. What am I trying to find out here?
Mission, vision, then strategy and tactics, right? And getting them all in alignment. I mean, I hear you talking about alignment a lot there. I think that's so important. If we brought you on to consult, for a team that wanted to really start cultivating emotional intelligence, they've been listening to this and they say, yeah, Dr. King, I hear you. I feel that. I want to make this happen in my organization. Where do we start? What's the process for someone or a team leader, a lab leader who wants to start building that culture? What's usually the best place to get them off and running?
Yeah, I think from a leadership perspective, it's that leader or that key personnel digging into what is emotional and social intelligence. What is it? And to do an assessment around EQ.
Yeah.
Take a view of yourself around emotional and social intelligence. Where are your strengths? Where are your weaknesses? And getting that type of feedback of, gosh, here are my tendencies, and here's where I may have a gap. How do I begin to grow? Because, Andy, I think we can better influence others when we better know and understand ourselves. Maybe where are some gaps that we need to listen more closely to somebody else, and where are our strengths and how do I leverage that?
Mm.
So I think from a leadership perspective, it is allowing ourselves to go through like an EQ assessment and better understand, gosh, what's it saying about me? And better yet, I think from a developmental standpoint, is doing like an EQ 360. What are the people around me saying about me?
Mm,
How do they view the emotions and how I'm using those types of things?
right.
As I share a thought or idea at a team meeting, am I presenting it in a way that people are wanting to listen to it? Or does it come across more my way or the highway?
And that's so powerful. Having been through that kind of evaluation myself, it's both very challenging to get that kind of feedback sometime. And then at the same time, very powerful once you get and you said this earlier when you're talking about ego and pride and some of those kind of things. So I'll use the phrase disappointments, the delta between expectations and reality. So if you view yourself as a leader or as a professional a certain way, and that you find out the people around you have a different perspective, well, that can be challenging to deal with, but so powerful
Oh, yeah.
once you unlock it and start to move forward.
Being willing to open ourselves up to get some feedback because if we go in blind, we're not having the influence that we can. And think of it, not so much as making us better, it's we're able to accomplish goals more effectively.
Right.
We're able to have that greater influence when we do show up that way. So it's not about us. It's about what are we trying to achieve as a part of that. That is so important. I do a program at Columbus Zoo and we do a leadership cohort. It's like 8 months long. And I've had several veterinarians as a part of that. It's the idea they're so very technical, but they have to work with other employees at the zoo that care for animals. So there's a balance of how do I communicate this animal's ill? They may have to put it down, but it's the idea of how do I have the conversations around that and be able to engage people in the process.
Yeah, back to that alignment, mission, vision, and keeping everybody on the same page. That we can do more together and
Yeah.
that advance that mission. That's really important. You opened the door and mentioned technical expertise since we're dealing with an audience as largely technical
Yes.
professionals. How does this concept of emotional intelligence intersect with that technical expertise, maybe in the lens of the sciences specifically? You gave a great example there of working with veterinarians. Do you find that technical experts are more or less receptive to this idea of emotional intelligence than, say, folks in the maybe sales or marketing professions? Is that a tougher hill to climb with technical experts?
I don't know if it's so much more of a challenge. That's where you see a lot of additional, I'm going to say, light bulbs going off, insights to that. Because when it comes to decision making, everything is the technical pieces. Here's what the research says, or here are the steps along the way, or here's the whatever data that they're beginning to look at. So when they start to see the emotion side, oh, okay, it often relates to how am I working with somebody else? How am I trying to communicate that piece there? And if it digs in even further, sometimes we may have all the steps from a technical perspective, but if we listen to people's questions and ideas, that's where I said earlier, we can fine tune something that really brings it up a couple notches to be even more effective. What do I notice the difference? I think it's the greater insights. Oh, I see that. I'm uncomfortable with that. I don't like that, but I get this. How do I get better at it? It's the discomfort that it brings, but generally, I find people are willing to look at it because generally I'm working with individuals that want to grow.
Right.
So I think there's that bias that's a part of the work that we do.
Well, that your experience there, aligns with my observation as I, work with our board of directors or committee leaders within PSA or attendees at our conferences. There is that desire. We may be, as I joke, the hard sciences rather than you and I, these fuzzy social scientists. But there is that desire to get better, and I think that those aha moments are kind of fun. I always love seeing those. And so I want to tap back into your ground and experience in youth development. Let's think about the skills, the traits, the characteristics You got me one time. I said something about soft skills, and you said, no, 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 they're critical skills. But what are the skills, traits, things that you see as becoming increasingly important for future research leaders, young faculty members, young technical experts in the fields of agriculture extension, maybe in our space and poultry field specifically?
Yeah, and I'll add another name to these skills. It's critical skills. Most really recently, I was listening to a podcast somewhere, and they referred to them as power skills
Oh, I love that.
because I think that it gives us a greater power of influence. And I think it comes down to empathy is one of those. How do we better understand others? It's how do we build alliances and partnerships, as a part of that? How do we engage people in the processes of the things that we're doing? How do we develop good relationships and mend bad relationships? I think it has to be both ways because through our work, sometimes relationships are strained. And part of that is the emotion piece. So, not only how do we build relationships, but then how do we go back and mend relationships to stay engaged and rather than going our separate ways? How do we invest in the people so that they grow, become more effective? It's not about, and at one time, I thought, gosh, if I grow too much, they're going to leave the organization.
Yeah.
And you've probably heard this before. Well, what if you don't give them any training and they stay?
Right.
I think, no, you got to invest. You got to look for opportunities for people to grow because if they're happy, being satisfied, they can add. And if they go on, we've had that influence. And you never know when things will come back around.
I always say my philosophy is I want to make sure that my team is so good that people want to steal them and that they're so happy they don't want to leave.
Right on. Yeah.
If you were, I'm going to give you, as we wrap up our time together, Dr. King, if I gave you the magic wand and you were suddenly dean of the grad school for a day, if you could embed one trait or characteristics related to emotional intelligence, these power skills that we've been talking about, into every grad student's program for future researchers and leaders, this is your chance. How are you going to, or what skill trait program would you put in there to really help them open the door to some of these possibilities we've been discussing?
Yeah. Oh. Only one? I only get one. No.
You're only dean for a day. My magic wand was only so powerful.
From my experience, what I'd like every graduate student to experience, and even every faculty member, is to actually go through an EQ assessment. Because I think you understand EQ better when you've related personally to it.
Hmm.
Because we can talk about the concept of self awareness, of self management, empathy, and building relationships. But until you see yourself around those categories, I don't think it speaks as clearly. Cognitive, we think we understand it, we get it, but it's not touched our heart. What that's going to be, oh, that's soft, but it doesn't touch our inner self. I don't think it's as effective with that. So it's us relating to it.
It's really powerful, Dr. King, and I just thank you so much for sharing these insights and your expertise and your example. It's been really powerful to me in my own professional development as a leader in our industry. Dr. King was also a speaker at our inaugural Poultry Science Association Professional Development Conference, which is a good reminder that you can join us for our second conference. We're now calling the PSA Pathways Summit. It'll be coming up this October 27th and 28th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Save the date for that. More information will be available soon on the meetings and conferences page at poultryscience.org. Speaking of meetings, early bird registration for the PSA annual meeting and the North American Scientific Conference coming up this summer in Raleigh closes today. If you are listening to this on the day the episode debuts and you haven't yet registered for annual meeting, go do it at poultryscience.org. Our best rates of the season are available to you yet. If you missed last week's episode of the podcast with Dr. Susan Lamont, part of our historical series, that was such a great conversation talking about her 40 years experience in genetic innovation. Make sure you go back and listen to that, and then do rate us and subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already. That rating really helps surface the podcast to other folks like you who could benefit from these conversations. Next week, we're going to talk with PSA President Martin Zudoff about innovations in poultry nutrition. Dr. Zudoff is an expert in precision feeding, big data guy, and has been a treat to work with as PSA president. So looking forward to taking his temperature on some of the innovations happening in the nutrition space through a lot of the technologies and big data and generative AI and all these things that are happening around us all the time. For more information about PSA and all of our various programs, go to our website, follow us on LinkedIn, and stay tuned to next week's episode of Unplugged. For the Poultry Science Association, I'm Andy Vance.